Welcome to Constant Variables, a podcast where we take a non-technical look at mobile app development. I'm Tim Bornhold. Let's get nerdy. Today we are chatting with Jonathan Hassell of Hassell Inclusion. So Jonathan's been working in the accessibility space for his entire career. He initially cut his teeth over at the BBC, which was really cool to hear his experience. He talks about that a little bit on today's podcast. But these days, Jonathan runs an organization called Hassell Inclusion. And what he does there is helps organizations really around the world figure out ways to embed accessibility into their ethos so that they are being accessible from the ground floor. In this episode, we talk about accessibility and digital inclusion, why you should not just think of accessibility as a legal obligation, but rather as a way to make more money, how to make your app better for the 20% of those with accessibility needs, but not at the expense of the other 80%, and we both chat about our favorite advances in accessibility technology. For example, did you know that one of the early inventors of the typewriter did so to help his blind friend communicate with the world? I certainly did not know that. So hopefully you learn that and much more by listening to today's episode. So without further ado, here is my interview with Jonathan Hassell. Jonathan Hassell, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
I'm really excited to have you on today. Why don't you, just so my audience can get to know you a little bit, why don't you tell us about yourself and about your company, Hassell Inclusion?
Sure. So the short version, I have been doing accessibility since I joined the BBC around about 2001, so almost 20 years now. And I spent 10 years there really learning in a place where you could afford to be best practice. The BBC were always the organization that really cared about how disabled people experienced the sorts of services they had, whether it was TV or radio, and then what I was doing, which was online, and then mobile apps from there. So I spent 10 years at the BBC, absolutely loved it, and learned a lot. And I channeled that into standards. I created the British Standard for Accessibility, BS 8878, at the end of 2010. And then I kind of felt like my work at the BBC was done. It was an organization that cared about it and was good at accessibility. And I, from my work on the British Standard, had worked with a number of people in organizations that maybe didn't care and weren't so good, and saw how I could share the sorts of experience that I'd been really blessed to have there. So I left the BBC, set up Hassell Inclusion, 2011. The last 9 years have been amazing. It seems to have gone by in a flash. We've been sort of helping organizations all over the world to go on this journey of accessibility and inclusive design and enable them to get to a place where they kind of feel both competent and confident that they know what to do and why to do it, how it could actually benefit them as, whatever organization I'm working with. So it's been a really great ride, and, delighted to be with you here today, to share some of those things with your audience.
Right on. So I want to take probably 7 giant steps backwards because I like to play devil's advocate a lot. And, maybe there's people that are listening to this that have never even heard the word accessibility before. And I'm curious, being the master that you are with having come up with standards and everything, and you've been doing this for so long, if somebody came up to you and had no idea what accessibility was, how would you describe accessibility?
Yeah. So, I describe it in different ways for different people. I think one that I like, that I've been using recently with product managers, and it really kind of chimes with them because it takes them into a slightly different place from if they've been thinking about accessibility before. I tend to think about this as usability for the people that you generally tend to forget. In general, accessibility is all about making your product work for people who have a disability. But that's really just the start of things, because when I think of accessibility and inclusive design, I think of all of the people who maybe don't use your product the way that you do. Most people who create a product generally tend to make me feel old, and generally tend to be quite young, tend to be very tech savvy. It's all about their amazing capabilities. Rather than things that maybe they don't understand, or if you like, disabilities that they have. But actually, there's a huge number of people in the world who maybe can't see it as well as the people who created the app that they're looking at. Maybe don't hear as well. That could be because they have a disability. That could be because they've been disabled from birth, or it could be something that they've acquired through life. It could be my mum. She's 81. She doesn't have a disability. That's not how she would introduce herself to anybody. But her eyesight is going. She can't see as well as she used to. She can't read books anymore. She reads books on an iPad. Because she's able to turn the backlight on, so everything's a lot brighter for her, to make the fonts bigger so that she can read them, because normally in a normal kind of standard printed book that unfortunately she can't any longer. So accessibility, if you like, is for disabled people, for older people. It's also for all of us, really going forwards. There are occasions where we don't have the capabilities that we ourselves normally enjoy. It could be that we've had an accident. Maybe we've fallen over skiing and broken our arm and suddenly realized what it's like to have difficulties using a mouse or using a touchpad, a touchscreen. Or it could be, for that matter, the Amazon Echo, which is in my kitchen. So I don't have a disability, not yet at least. But when I'm cooking, and I want to, a track has come on to the music that I'm listening to when I'm cooking that I don't particularly like so much. I don't really want to kind of go over and sort of like press anything on my phone to go to the next track. But voice recognition in the Amazon Echo allows me to do that. Well, that voice recognition that I'm using there is very similar to the voice recognition that a lot of people use if they have difficulty using their hands. And actually, a lot of the ways of thinking about how to create an Alexa skill that can be used by somebody who, if you like, can't touch and can't see, because actually the Amazon Echo makes everybody like that because it doesn't have a screen or a keyboard. That's where, if you like, the whole area of accessibility that used to just be for people with disabilities becomes something that actually all of us can understand as being something we want. It's not for other people than myself. It's actually for me when I'm in those circumstances. So it's just thinking a lot sort of broader, a lot wider than just one way of using a mobile app. It's saying how going forward can we enable everybody to use this, in whatever situational context they're in.
And that's a fantastic definition, because that's one thing I've found when I've been as an app developer and going through and building out accessibility is I've been learning about all these really cool things that Apple and Google have baked into their operating system that we can all take advantage of. And it's like I tell people now when I'm talking about accessibility is at some point in your life, everyone is going to need to use these features, whether you use them now as I'm 32 years old as we record this, and I have pretty much full capabilities with all my faculties. So I don't need to increase the font size on the screen, but I know at some point I have terrible eyesight, and I know I have a family history of poor eyesight. So I know that at some point I'm going to need to bump up the font size. And that in and of itself is like, my next question was going to be, why should I care about accessibility? And after hearing your definition, you'd be kind of daft to ask that question. But I'm curious to hear if you would want to expand on that at all, as somebody that builds an app, why is it important to think about other ways to include people into using your software?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything that you said there is really spot on. I mean, what we find is that most people, when they think of accessibility, especially in the States, tend to think about the legal reasons for doing it. That, if we don't do this properly, some disabled person will sue me. And that, certainly in the environment that we're in, at the moment that can be true. There are, there were more lawsuits started every day last year in the States than one. So I mean, literally, I think it was 2,800 over the course of the year. So there are good legal reasons to do this, but we tend to think that's the kind of like the worst reason for getting into accessibility. The way we tend to think about the legal side of things is it's almost like an insurance policy. And, I don't know about you, but I'm very aware that I'm probably not alone in going to a comparison website when I buy my insurance every year. And there are products from all sorts of different companies. And invariably, I, like most people, go to that website because I want to pay as little for my insurance, for my car, my house, my whatever, as I can, because whilst something might happen, and so therefore it would be stupid of me to not have any insurance. I just don't think it's going to happen to me. I don't think my car's going to crash. I don't think my house is going to burn down. So therefore, am I going to spend huge amounts of money on loads of benefits that I don't think I'm going to need, because those benefits only come to me if the worst happens? Well, no, I'm probably just going to spend the minimum. And in the accessibility world, that's called compliance. I think compliance is an okay place to start, but it's really kind of impoverished in thinking, really, because we tend to think about accessibility from the point of view that we've been talking, which is this is everybody potentially who needs this. So this isn't about, making sure that your product is usable for all of your customers and then doing this compliance thing just in case you get sued by some person who has a disability. People with disabilities make up about 20% of the population already in most countries. And actually, once we look at all of those other categories of people who may need accessibility, 20% of the population who are baby boomers. They have lots of money. In fact, they probably have more money than most of the rest of us who are working. So why would you want to say no to that money? Why would you not want them to be your customers? And then, as soon as you go into places like, the Amazon Echo or those sorts of things, you hit on rich seams where organizations are finding that when they think about people who at that point seem very different from themselves, maybe, how would I do this app for somebody who can't see? All of these sorts of things. It's really challenging. And initially that's something maybe that you might want to do without. You just don't like the challenge. But what we found is that most organizations who really kind of step up to the challenge and look at it from a creative viewpoint rather than a compliance viewpoint end up in places which are amazing. The innovations of the world actually regularly come from looking at people who don't like the current way of doing things. Alexander Graham Bell was trying to help deaf people when he invented the telephone. The first typewriter in the world was created for a blind countess. These were created for people with a disability, but these are fundamental increases in innovation that everybody benefits from going forwards. So, our way of looking at things is, you can start off with compliance and trying to get a better night's sleep because you're going to be okay. But that's really the start of the opportunities. And if that's where people end, it's kind of sad. Because our way of looking at things is you wouldn't do that for any other of your customers. Keep your business brain turned on. Why do we care about customer experience in the first place? Because if we're selling something, if we give great customer experience, people buy it and they come back and they buy more. Well, why would you want to like get rid of 20-40% of your customers? That makes no
Right.
sense. When it comes to sort of customer service in terms of people, maybe asking for a service from you, one of the reasons why most people who are kind of in government are looking at a digital is because it's a much cheaper way of handling customer service inquiries, whether it's getting a new driving license or a passport or whatever it is. That's so much cheaper if you can do it online than if people had to sort of go to a call center or a town hall or something like that. So every single person who can't use that digital mechanism for doing things actually costs you more money, because you actually have to say, okay, well, you'll need to go to the call center or you'll need to go to the town hall. And certainly the figures we have here in the UK is that's a huge order of magnitude, much more expensive for those organizations. I mean, I could spend, the rest of your entire podcast season talking about the benefits of these sorts of things. We've identified at least kind of 40, everything from sort of like, millennials actually want to work for organizations that are actually ethical and care. And so most organizations, want to be inclusive and diverse. And they can't really be that without taking the needs of everybody into account. And it just goes on and on and on. So for us, the opportunities are huge, if you like. The water is lovely. We're encouraging people to dive in, every month in our business benefits workshops. And, we have organizations in the past who thought this was just, an insurance policy they didn't think they needed, that they're now understanding that this could be the thing that makes their business. This could be their unique selling point, or it could be the thing that enables them to create the next innovation that starts getting them to become a household name if they're not yet. It's a real opportunity.
Absolutely. And I'm sure, like you said, with all the innovations that have come out of people trying to help people that have disabilities, it seems kind of foolish to not be creative and incorporate that into your thought process from the get-go. One way that I know you have brought up in the past to encourage organizations to incorporate this into their process is something called inclusive design. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to, as long as we're in this early stage of just defining what these different terms are, maybe walk through what inclusive design is and how that might be a way for organizations to incorporate accessibility into their ground zero thought as they're coming out with new products.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, inclusive design is not a new term. It's been around for ages. And certainly in my mind, inclusive design and digital accessibility are pretty much the same thing. In some ways, it's all about enabling people to understand the opportunities. A lot of people, when they think of accessibility, they think of just disabled people. So, if there are 20% of the population who have a disability, well, accessibility is about the 20%. It's not about the 100%. For me, inclusive design is about the 100%. Inclusive design is saying that if you create something, if you create a product and it's not accessible, in inverted commas, and then you make it accessible. So if you like, you make it better for 20% of the potential users, but in doing that, you actually make it worse for the other 80% of users. Well, you haven't really done something sensible for your business. Maybe, that's good from a compliance perspective, but from a business perspective, that's the wrong side of the 80-20 rule. What you really want is something that works for everyone. You do not want to leave a single person behind. You want everybody to have the same sort of great brand experience when they come to the sort of products you're creating, whether they're mobile apps or, Apple Watch apps, whatever they are. And so, from my point of view, I think the good thing about the fact that people are kind of clustering around the word inclusive design now is, number one, some of them think that it's new. I don't really care if they do, just as long as they think it's cool. That's great. Some of us have been doing this forever, but that just means you can learn from our mistakes in the past. If you're new to this, grab it with both hands, and if you think it's cool, then that's a great reason for doing that. So inclusive design is just effectively saying, look, we want the things that we create to be used by everyone, and every single designer, developer, content author, product manager that I know really wants to make sure that that everyone gets a great experience of their products. Why wouldn't you want that? It just makes sense.
Well, yeah, it's foolish to not be inclusive from the get-go, like you said. And I also like that you mentioned that sometimes people take it to the extreme of making sure that their app is accessible for the 20%, but at the detriment of the other 80%, where that's foolish as well. And, I think people can kind of dig their heels in sometimes around accessibility. And it is like you said, if you come at it from the thought process of we have to do this because legal told us to, then that's like a negative thing, but you shouldn't. If you don't come at it from that approach and you actually think about what the benefits are from it, it's like, I think pretty much every single app that I've ever worked on that we've focused on accessibility just in and of itself is better, because it does lend itself to things that would make it for able-bodied people as well. It makes it better for them in certain ways. And even little things like making sure the font colors are have enough contrast that it's easier to read. There was that whole design paradigm a few years ago where it was always like white background with like slightly darker white text on top of it. And it's like, no one can read that. You have to squint and get close to it. And, it's just things like that are kind of ridiculous. and I'm glad that people are starting to think about how it can be better for disabled people and able-bodied people at the same time.
I think it has to be everybody. I do not want to swap 80% of people who love my product for 20% of people who love my product. I want them all, and I also want my brand to be my brand. And I think that's the interesting thing. So we work with companies who, if you like, their main focus is to make sure that everybody can use their product no matter what it looks like. So for them, usability is everything. It's not so much about aesthetics. We also work with high fashion brands for whom if the product doesn't have the aesthetics that they believe are representative of their brand, then the product isn't representative of their brand, and that is a problem. So it's one of the joys of, if you like, having left the BBC and owning a business and working with multiple clients all over the world, is that we can see this from all of these different angles. And, unfortunately, some of the guidelines that were created by accessibility professionals, myself amongst them, don't always think about every organization out there that might need these things. They assume that, it doesn't really matter that a particular color is used, or these sorts of things, because the only thing that matters in those accessibility guidelines is making sure that as many people as humanly possible can access things. It doesn't mean necessarily that any of them would like it or that it represents your brand well. So if you like, that's the other part of what I would consider to be there in inclusive design is, design is communication. Design, the design process, certainly the one that I've experienced on every project that we've worked on, is where you have designers in a room who could go left or right. They've got all sorts of different options. Which of these design options is the best thing? And how do we be creative about it? How do we take those rules and say, these were designed to help us, rather than designed to be a straitjacket? And actually, where these things are challenging, then what can we do about it? One of the big things that that are there in the standards that I've created is space for an idea of personalization. We already know, for example, that my mum is going to want a website that looks very, very different from someone who's dyslexic. Someone who's dyslexic wants really kind of calm colors, pastel colors, text to be created in those sort of background and foreground colors that isn't too harsh or glaring. And enables them to read a lot more easily than they would otherwise. My mum would find that rather difficult to read, and she would want black and white, and she'd want signs like you get in an airport, with real kind of bold stuff. So on occasions, you actually have to expand your idea of what inclusive design is to say, if we want everybody to get a great experience of this, and if we don't want to leave anyone behind, then sometimes we may have to increase the idea of personalization so that everybody gets an experience which is best for them, rather than, if you like, a watered down sort of lowest common denominator thing that people have really been scared about accessibility bringing to design in the past. Inclusive design is saying, let's do something great for everybody rather than do something that everybody might kind of go meh to,
That kind of makes sense of when you're trying to create. It's kind of one of the difficult parts of this, right? Is like you said, you have to balance so many different interests, and at the end of the day, there may have to be, with that level of personalization, is having room in whatever design you come up with. Let it breathe to the point that if somebody needs to increase the font size, that it doesn't throw everything completely out of whack, that you give them the capability to make the fonts brighter or make it darker or make it easier to consume in that way, but not completely take away from. I know what you mean about the high fashion designs, high fashion companies. They really do care about their brand and the way that things look, and whether it looks good for somebody with complete control of their eyesight and somebody that has poor eyesight. It's like they're still going to want the person with poor eyesight to be wowed by whatever they come out with, whatever their design is. And it is like everything is very important in those details. So it is an interesting challenge for somebody that has to go through and come up with these. And one question I wanted to ask, and to kind of bring this into some sort of tangible actions that people that are listening to this, if they already have an app or if they're working on apps, that's kind of where I wanted to start driving the conversation towards, is some thoughts that you might have on some ways that people can address these issues. So one question I have was, if you have an app today, let's say that you have no idea whether your app is accessible or not, like you're really starting at ground zero with all of this stuff. What's some of the first things you do when an organization comes to you and says, here's our stuff? Is it accessible? How do you help them figure out what the line is here?
Yeah. So, I mean, so if they have a product already, that's very, very different than if an organization is about to start creating a product, and then we can kind of get very early into the process. The difficulty, if an organization has already created their app and they don't know if it's accessible, chances are it probably isn't very good, because if they don't know, it probably means they haven't had conversations with the people who did the design, the people who did the coding. They probably haven't done any testing of it to see whether it is. So what that means, every product manager, every project manager knows in the world that the cost of fixing a bug depends on when you find it. And if you can find your bugs early rather than late, then it will be much cheaper to fix them. That's why Agile was invented. So yeah, if you've already got your app and you don't know if it's accessible, if you like, the bad news is everything that may be, if you like, wrong with it from an accessibility viewpoint is going to be harder for you to fix than if you'd have actually started thinking about that earlier. That said, that's the situation you're in. So what do? So pretty much the first thing to do is to do some sort of test. And the two tests that, the one test that everybody does is an accessibility audit. So that's a test against guidelines. Here are a lot of rules that you could have applied when you created that thing. Let's see if you did. And let's find all of the places where this product either passes or fails this set of criteria. And that's pretty much the standard way that 99% of the world kind of does things. It ends up with a report that generally makes people cry because it's really, really long. I've seen those reports go on for sort of like over 100 pages. And one of the things I often say to people is, when do you ever get time to read a 100-page report? There's something actually about this audit process that almost is just a little bit overwhelming to organizations who actually haven't thought about accessibility earlier. The other way of doing it, I think it's a much more interesting and much more sort of creative way, is to either get so we have what we call a live audit. It's something we do at Hassell Inclusion because we really dislike the idea that we're telling people that they've got everything wrong all of the time, and we're doing that almost in a company comes to us, they ask us to test their product, they don't hear from us for sort of like 2, maybe 3 weeks, and then we send them a report telling them everything that's wrong with their product. That's not particularly friendly from our point of view. It's not really who we are as a company. Who we are is people who do not want to test your product. We want to help you fix your product, because that's the thing that is actually going to change the world. That's going to change your ability to service customers who have disabilities. That's going to give you return on investment. A load of problems is just kind of annoying, really. So for us, it's how do we take people through that test to somewhere where they can fix things. And so actually our live audit is something where we go to organizations and we say, we're going to spend a day with you and we're actually going to do this together. So we're going to sit in your offices, ideally with your team, the people who created this thing, and we're going to show you. We're going to go through maybe not everything in your app, ideally the kind of like the key user journeys, the main things that people really care about. We're going to go through those as if we're someone who's blind, who's using a screen reader. We're going to go through those as if we're dyslexic, and so maybe we're changing colors and these sorts of things. And we're going to see what sort of experience is there, and we're going to enable you to not only understand what that experience is, but what about that experience would be problematic for those people, and how then do you fix it? So rather than us creating a big long report, most people take that report when it's given to them and put it into something like Jira, a bug tracking system. So actually we say, let's just forget the report. We'll demonstrate things to you so you understand what they are, and you can be putting them directly into your Jira while we're in the room. Sometimes we've had occasions where people have actually fixed things while we're in the room as well, which is great. That to us is really a great thing. So we like ways of educating. Our value system at Hassell Inclusion is we hate telling people what they got wrong, especially when it's so late that it's going to cost lots of money to fix it. We actually prefer training people in how to get things right. And so even our audits are partly training, enabling people to understand why this thing is so important, who it impacts, what the problem is, what they can do about it. That's the sort of stuff that's, that we care about. And so yeah, that's the sort of thing, and we kind of segue through from there into training, because, normally a lot of organizations who have got a lot of things wrong then want to know, well, how to fix them, and how to make sure, if you like, having fixed this never happens again. So that's the kind of start of the process.
That's brilliant, because I was, when you mentioned the word audit, my first thought was to think of if I've ever heard of a positive use of that word in my life. And anytime anyone gets an audit, it's like they instantly tense up and think, "Oh God, what did I do wrong?" And it comes at a point of defense rather than as a point of offense. You can actually go in and say, "Hey, this is what's actually going on," and being able to walk somebody through and show them, here's screen reading technology. Here's why this stuff is important. Like, I'm sure you probably don't take it as far as to like blindfold somebody and say, use the app. But that would be something where it's like, that'd be so useful to somebody that doesn't really get why these things are important to the 20% of people that don't have those capabilities.
Yeah, we do the blindfold thing on occasions, not normally in live audits, normally in awareness exercises. You do have to be a little careful, because as soon as you blindfold someone, effectively what's happening is you're taking them to day one, ground zero of maybe having lost your sight. And that is a scary day. I've had colleagues who have had accidents and lost their sight, and the rehabilitation process can be very, very challenging. There is something about sort of like walking a mile in someone else's shoes. But the thing is, they're someone else's shoes. Most people who use a screen reader, for example, will be doing this all of the time. So if you've never used one before, you might think, how on earth does anybody, you don't know what's right, you don't know what's wrong. It's just overwhelming. So that's where the expertise of our team come in. We're enabling people to understand what the experiences are of people who have these disabilities, all of the time. This isn't a one-shot deal. This isn't a simulation. This is actually a kind of daily occurrence. We do, and something that's possibly the one thing we love more than live audits is user testing, where we put people in a viewing room in a user testing lab like you would do as usability, but we have lots of people with disabilities trying to use their product. And certainly one of the great things that I learned at the BBC in my years there, I was head of usability and accessibility. So I have a great value for people. Your product is accessible or usable in my mind if somebody who has a disability is able to use it. It's not accessible if you like the rules from WCAG or whoever say it is, because actually accessibility, if you like, abstracts out a lot of those things that are different between people with a disability and people who don't have a disability. But the people who wrote WCAG were very clear that if they put in all of the usability guidelines as well, it would just go on for much longer. So actually, you won't find that much usability in there. So if you like if you pass accessibility guidelines, what it's effectively saying is your product isn't discriminating. That people with disabilities will probably be able to use it to roughly the same extent as everybody else who don't have disabilities. However, if your product is unusable, then it's unusable for all of those people. So if you get into a lab, you actually cut through that difference between usability and accessibility. You go directly to what, in the end, is going to be massively important for your business, which is, what do my customers think about the experience that we're giving them? And you're just broadening that out to say, actually, we're going to include the 20% of people who have a disability rather than assume that they don't exist. So that's, if you like, that kind of next step to go on. Because you could have, a product which is very accessible that, everybody doesn't want to use. So it's not discriminatory. It's just awful for everybody. I don't think you've actually won very much there. And for us, it's all about winning. We want people to win. We don't really want people to be compliant without them sort of really kind of pushing on through to how much money did that cost us? Was that worth it for us? What are we getting from this? Where is the return on our investment? Because I've been in circumstances, as I say, I've been in this business for a long, long time. I've sat on panels. I've met people who have done accessibility brilliantly in an organization, and then they've left. And they've gone on to another organization, and the place that they used to work doesn't have their champion for accessibility anymore. And so nobody, they care less and less about it over time, because nobody said, actually, in doing this stuff, if we count, if we do the sorts of A/B testing and analytics and everything else that sensible people who work in digital do, especially sort of product managers, we should expect that if we make our product more accessible, the more people use it. And if that isn't happening, it's maybe because we're not even marketing to those people. So we could have created, if you like, the most accessible app in our category. But it could be that everybody who had a particular type of disability thought that they would never be able to use any of the apps in that category. And so actually you could have done something brilliant to have helped nobody because people just didn't expect you to have done that. So actually part of this for us is to be really holistic and, if you like, business minded about it. Not, accessibility for us is not just a technical thing about how you design or how you code something, but is actually a way of engaging with an audience who potentially at the moment can't use your product. And if you do the right things, and that includes communication as well as the technical accessibility stuff, they could be the most loyal customers that you will ever have. Because the alternatives, there's still, relatively few organizations that are good at this. So if you become the one product in your category, which is great at accessibility, then you may find that you've just got a whole host of people, if you communicate well, who will be, if you like, customers for life because they've tried the rest and that was awful. And you've gone that extra mile to make sure that not only is it compliant, but it's a great experience.
Well, there's so much in there to unpack. But I think that, one thing I kept thinking about is like, I think a lot of people, especially stateside, listening to this podcast probably turned it on because they wanted to learn about like WCAG, or they wanted to learn about whatever kind of standard that they needed to follow and what are the steps 1 to 3 to just get this off my plate and go. But I mean, you're really arguing here for this is a total change in your mindset. If you want to be compliant, you have to really, it has to be kind of a cultural change. And I think that for most businesses, that especially the larger you get, the harder it's going to be to change that culture. So, from that perspective, when you go into an organization that's large and coming at it from that perspective of, being guarded and audits and all that negative side of things, what types of tactics do you use in order to change mindsets and in order to kind of get that spark going so that it can be a cultural shift to be thinking about inclusive design from the get-go?
Yeah, it used to be so much harder than now. CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella. Start of last year, so start of 2019, LinkedIn put 50 big ideas for 2019 on LinkedIn, on its own platform. Number 6 in that list was inclusive design. Just to give you a little bit of a kind of context for it, number 5 was something that's notorious in my country at the moment, Brexit. That's whether we love it or hate it, it's sure something that all organizations have to take really seriously. So that's number 5. Number 6 is inclusive design. Number 7 is artificial intelligence.
Wow.
So if you think about that for a second, is most CTOs out there if they're not thinking about artificial intelligence at the moment, probably their boss is thinking, did we get the right person? Everybody pretty much agrees that that's the future. We just don't know what the right way of using all of these kind of like new tools is. But if accessibility and inclusive design are in there with that, why would you not take that seriously? And if you've got Satya Nadella, staking so much of Microsoft on this, we've got a situation with literally a new client who came to us this morning. And they were saying, they had a demonstration of all of the technologies that Microsoft are creating in this area, and they said you would have to be an idiot to not be doing inclusive design. That's it's so much easier now than it used to be because all of the big companies really take this hugely seriously. What we do is we enable the smaller organizations who maybe aren't creating, assistive technologies and operating systems and all of those sorts of things. I've got one app. How does this help me win? I've got business goals this year. If I spend money on this inclusive design thing, am I more or less likely to actually achieve what is important for me in my yearly goals? And then for the huge companies, to be perfectly honest, they're all now in a situation where they're thinking, if we are not good at this, we are being left behind. So most of the larger organizations who are coming to us, who are effectively, the first conversation is kind of like, we know we need this, but we don't know how to do it. Can you fix us? And the great news, is that, I've spent all of my career in accessibility trying to be able to put in place the tools to be able to answer that question. The latest one is called ISO 30071 Part 1. It's a new international standard that I've been working on for years, published last year. And that is almost a blueprint for what those organizations need to do to embed this as just the way they work. For us, an organization that is good at inclusive design is an organization that almost doesn't need to talk about it anymore. It's just part of business as usual. It's, good design includes this. It's not a separate thing. It is the way that you create products for everybody. It's not a tacked on thing at the end. These are all of the things that the large companies are saying, and a lot of kind of digital agencies and people like that these days are saying our clients requiring this from us, and maybe we've spent some time actually getting good at this, but how do we prove it? How do we enable if you're an app owner out there, or and you've gone to a digital agency for your app to be created, and you care about inclusive design, you care about getting that 100% of customers rather than just 80, then how do you know, what questions do you ask that digital agency to know that they're actually going to deliver you 100% rather than 80%? Because every digital agency, if you say, do you know how to do accessibility? They will say yes. But most of them haven't really got a clue how to deliver it. And they are hoping that you weren't serious, so you don't ask again. Or if you were serious, that you find out really late on in the day when it's too late for anybody to do anything about it. So a lot of what we do these days is to try and enable organizations to have we talked about audits of websites. An audit is, if you like, an external organization full of experts in accessibility looking at your product and saying, is it safe? Is it a product that is works according to these guidelines? Is it going to work for a disabled person? That's a product. What we're interested in as much as products is organizations, which is, are Google safe to create products that work for everybody? How do they, as an organization, say we have made this just the way we work? So every time we create a product, it's not a one-off. It's how we work. We make things right every single time. That's what our, if you like, audits with the new international standard are about. They're much deeper. They go into how do you do design? How do you do development? How do you do testing internally? How do you make sure that not only are you able to deliver this once, because somebody asked you to, because they really cared about this, but can you deliver this in a way which works for every single one of your projects, whatever that app is, whatever that website is, whatever other technology it might be for that matter? And how do you do that in a way which is really efficient, so you're not wasting money sort of fixing things too late in the day, but actually you're doing this right from the start so that it becomes a core competence that you can then give to all of the products that you're creating and the people that you're creating them for. And it doesn't cost the earth. That's where we're at. That's what the new international standard is designed to try and help organizations to say, this is what we need to do to get there. This is how we know we've got there, and this is how we can prove it to other people so they come to us rather than the people down the road who know the right answer but don't know anything more. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense to me. And I really appreciate you going through that. And I think a lot of organizations and people that are in organizations that are listening to this will at least have this as kind of the spark to start making changes in the organization to go towards that, being inclusive and hitting that 100% of users as opposed to just the 80%. I had one last question for you before we part ways. I feel like I'd be remiss not asking this of somebody that's been in the space for so long. And I'm sure you have so many stories of seeing people that were unable to use technology, use these different things before, but then now with all these different things coming out and seeing the progress of technology, it's enabling everybody to be able to use apps and technology. And I just, for somebody that's been in it for so long, I want to know from your perspective, what's been the coolest piece of technology that you've seen around accessibility that has enabled, whether it's you've seen it give a huge boost to people, or just whether you're like, man, I can't believe they finally pulled that off. It would just speak to that a little bit about what you've seen that's been kind of just shocking to you and exciting to you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a few quick ones. Number one, mobile itself is an assistive technology. So one of my team, he has a disability. He's been working with me for years and years. He is one of the best project managers I know. He's one of the best diversity and inclusion people I know. Whenever possible, we love working together. He has difficulty using his hands, and he finds it very difficult to use a keyboard on a laptop. For him, the keyboard on a mobile phone is a real benefit. So actually, for him, everything where people are going towards mobile first is a great benefit. So literally, the whole area of mobile, is potentially, if you like, the accessibility win for him, and especially, he uses a lot of speech recognition software, so things like Drag and Dictate on a Mac, Drag Naturally Speaking on a PC. These are really expensive items of assistive technology. They were created specifically for people who needed them. Now, WWDC last year, so Apple comes out saying actually voice control is part of iOS. It's part of the iPad OS. It's part of Mac OS. This is a fundamental part. We've, if you like, taken this as being something that was an addition that you added to your computer if you needed it, that might have cost you a lot of money. So therefore, very few people did. And we've now made this as actually a fundamental part of our operating system. I think that has huge potential. I wrote my first book using speech recognition technology, not because I have difficulty using my hands. I'm a pretty quick typist. I was tired. I was working during the day. I wanted to sort of be working on my book during the evening. I just didn't want to be typing. And also, a lot of the book was actually based on training that we do. So I would put up the training slide that I would normally use, and I would just talk into speech recognition. And it would create the first draft of my book for me. That I believe is cool, and actually, that I believe made my book a lot more human than otherwise, because it was more like a conversation. A lot of people said that it's a lot easier to read my books around accessibility than other people's, because they've got more kind of style to them in terms of you can hear my voice. It's funny in places. All of these sorts of things. There's a lot of stories. This is the stuff you do when you talk about things. When you write sort of like, books, it tends to get kind of dry and academic. That's not what I wanted. So mobile, I think, is great. Other things, seeing AI, go and check it out. There's a whole raft of mobile apps that are now designed to help people who have difficulty seeing. So you can point it at things, and either through AI or crowdsourcing, you will get an answer as to kind of like, am I looking at, an audience of people in front of me, or am I trying to do a presentation with my back to the audience, looking at the kind of screen, as it were? So that sort of thing, massively beneficial for people with who are blind. We've done some things for really kind of fun innovation things for people who use sign language. There's very few in general people in the world who use sign language, and most of the rest of us don't know how to communicate. So it's kind of like two communities who never communicate between each other. And we've worked initially using Microsoft's Connect technology to pick up kind of body skeletons and things like that, to enable us to start applying machine translation and machine learning to try and work out what signs people were saying. Some of that technology is actually available on the front of my iPhone, X Plus in front of me here. So potentially, some of that can come through and really kind of change the way we communicate with an audience that's, get very, very disenfranchised. There are so many, I think, great opportunities out there for people to try and thinking very, very differently. And, we've got a case study on our website. One of the guys who kind of worked on that particular technology for us, for people who sign, is now working with, Reebok and all sorts of VR kind of like agencies on mechanisms that actually pick up, exactly the same sort of like gestures, but use them for something that might be a computer game, or might be an art exhibit, or all of these sorts of things. For me, when you step into a bigger world where you ask somebody, how does it work for you, and then try and work out if there's a technological solution that you can create to help them in their life. What can happen is you can come up, as I say, with some of those innovations that make you special, that make you stand out from every other sort of technology company out there. So I think some of that is, the opportunity. It's a great place if you can push past that. How do I do this? To, okay, let's really try to enable everybody to use what we're creating. Every challenge is potentially the thing that's going to make your company a massive success.
God, I can't think of a better way to end this. That was perfect. And I think the reason I wanted to end off on seeing some of those technologies that you were talking about too is I had the same reaction when I saw WWDC and they had the video of the guy who just was controlling the computer. He was in a wheelchair and like had no control to be able to touch it. And he was just able to talk and bring up quadrants and say exactly where he wanted to click. And it's like, just, I think the more we can show people that maybe aren't exposed to this accessibility world, show them what technology is capable of now and how we're continuing to innovate. It's just going to keep the wheels turning and letting people build better software for everyone. So if people want to get in touch with you, and I mean, who wouldn't want to use your company to help them incorporate this into their organizations? Tell us again where people can find you and how they can get in touch to learn more about this great stuff.
Sure. So, I mean, a couple of things. So, the best place to go is Hassell Inclusion. So that's HASSELL inclusion.com. That's where you'll kind of find me and my company and our blogs and all our insights and things like that. We've got a couple of books. So if you go onto Amazon and you put in inclusive design for products, that is how to get the way you do product, to how to embed accessibility into that in a really efficient, exciting way. Inclusive Design for Organizations is the other book, and that got to number one in the Amazon sort of charts last year in the US and the UK, which kind of proves that a lot of organizations out there are saying, how do we kind of do this? So yeah, Inclusive Design for Products, Inclusive Design for Organizations, HassellInclusion.com. We'd love for you to get in touch. As I say, I'm Jonathan Hassell. You can find me on Twitter at John Hassell, on LinkedIn. The usual places really. But so delighted to have been on the call with you today. Tim, as I say, I think it's been a really interesting conversation, and I hope this just kind of changes the way people think about this. What you were talking about earlier, the mindset thing. We think accessibility is the coolest thing in the world, and we want to kind of share that with people and take them on a journey. So if anybody wants to come and get some help for that journey, we'd be delighted to hear from them.
Right on. Everyone reach out to Jonathan, get your mindset changed here. And thank you so much again for joining us today, Jonathan.
You're very welcome.
Thanks to Jonathan Hassell for joining me today here on the podcast. You can learn more about his organization, Hassell Inclusion, at HassellInclusion.com. That's HASSELL. Show notes for this episode can be found at constantvariables.co. You can get in touch with us by emailing hello@constantvariables.co. I'm at Tim Bornholt on Twitter, and the show is at CV_podcast. Today's episode was edited by the wondrous Jordan Daoust. A couple of things that I wanted to throw in this episode that I haven't in others. We're starting to do a grab bag episode of questions. So if you have any questions that you want to know about app development, how to get started, how to make your app better, and anything about apps that you just are really dying to know, feel free to reach out to us. Again, it's hello@constantvariables.co, or you can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, wherever you want. Just shoot some questions over our way. We'll get them compiled up, and we'll do sometime in the future here an episode about different questions. Also, the other thing I wanted to ask of you, our wonderful listener, is if you can take 2 minutes and head to iTunes and leave a review for us. You hear that all the time on podcasts, but it really does mean a lot, and it really does impact the way people can find our show. So if you can take a couple minutes, and we made it really easy for you. You can head to constantvariables.co/review. That'll pop you right in to the page where you can leave a review for us. So if you could do that, we would really greatly appreciate that. This episode was brought to you by the Jed Mahonis Group. If you are looking for a technical team who can help you navigate the complicated waters of mobile software development, give us a shout at jmg.mn.